Hello, and welcome to a brand new day of free-to-play here on Magic the Gathering Arena. Get Tish on the latest with me, Lord Rumfish. Black. Wild of Eldraine's black cards are the subject of today's Deckbuilding Toolbox series. So, just in a quick nutshell, the Deckbuilding Toolbox series is identifying subsets of cards which can either go into a wide variety of decks to give you the best tools in your toolbox for whatever you might want to build, or there might be a few kernels of deck ideas that are kind of buried in some of the suggestions, where maybe the card doesn't go in a wide variety of decks, but it's just a common or an uncommon. Maybe it sparks some interesting discussion. Anyway, we're going to start with the common and uncommon wild cards of black, and we will move into rare and mythic. Starting with Ego Drain. So this is, if you have a fairy, this is better than a Thoughtseize, which is quite a card. Now, if you don't have a fairy, I'm not convinced that this is worth an inclusion in your deck. I think the cost is too great most of the time if you don't have a fairy. You know, sometimes in the fairy deck, you'll be caught in a moment where you don't have a fairy. And you can decide for yourself if it's worth it to, you know, exile a land card from your hand in order to cast an Ego Drain. There will be moments. But if you're not a fairy deck, I'm not convinced that you should run this. The upside on this card is so high, though, that I think it's worth pointing out. And you can do a budget variant of fairies. That deck's not going to be as competitive, but you can do it with cards like Fairy Dream Thief. This one's good enough that I think some number between 1 and 4 could make it into your main deck list for a fairies deck. CGB did a fairies deck here just recently, where he was running 1 copy of this. You can decide for yourself how much of a budget you're on, how many copies you think you need. But it's worth noting, it turns on cards like Ego Drain and further down here, Fairy Fencing. Hopeless Nightmare is an interesting one. I think if you're not doing something with the enchantment, whether that's flickering it, bouncing it back to your hand, sacrificing it for a bargain, if you're not using the enchantment for any of those things, then Hopeless Nightmare is probably not worth a slot. However, if you are doing any of those, flickering it, bouncing it, sacrificing it, then yeah, this might be worth it. You know, it's card neutral, basically, right? Instead of replacing itself for you, it costs the opponent a card, and it loses them 2 life. So there is a potential case for using this in a really aggressive deck that wants to burn the opponent's face and trigger prowess. Normally those decks don't pair with black. Normally that's like blue-red, white-blue, white-red, some combination thereof. But you could try it. You could try a really, really aggressive start where, you know, you go Prowess Creature, turn 1 or 2, Hopeless Nightmare, start triggering the Prowess. You know, also make them lose 2 life. Costing them a card is also useful. You could see where you get to with that. I don't know. I would say that if Invoke Despair had still been legal in Standard, that some of these new enchantments, like Hopeless Nightmare, would have been amazing to pack into your deck as tech against Invoke Despair. But that's not the case anymore. So, it's a little bit more of a deck building puzzle, whether you think this is worth a slot. But it might be. Not Dead After All, we have some other effects that are like this in Standard. There's one that pulls the creature back and puts a +1 counter on it. This is similar. A Wicked Roll token depending on what synergies you have in your deck, is on paper, it's stronger than a +1 counter, right? Because if the aura goes to the graveyard, the opponent loses 1 life. It also puts another permanent onto the battlefield in the form of the aura. So if you're bargaining, or maybe you're trying to trigger the thing that cares about 2 permanents entering the battlefield, there are reasons that this could be more valuable than a +1 counter, depending on the construction of your deck. And this can trick a creature into play like one of the prototype creatures, right? Like the Phyrexian Worm with Lifelink and Menace, where you could get it back as the big version, the 7/5, and then you get to make it even bigger with the Wicked Roll token. This card has uses. There are similar effects already in Standard, but there might be reasons you want this one. Rat Out. So before we talk about this as creature removal and whether it's worth it there or not, I'd like to point out that this is an instant that puts a body on the battlefield. You do not have to target anything. It says up to 1 target creature. So you can just play this as a Flash Rat. Now it's a Flash Rat that can't block, and it's just a token, and it's just a 1/1. But all of that being said, you still get a 1/1 for 1 at instant speed. And that's not the worst. And then you could, for 2 mana, kill target Thalia. For 1 mana, you could kill target, something from like the Soldier deck, or there are some targets that Mono Red has. Mono Red does avoid 1 toughness sometimes with its creatures, but there's the Phoenix Chick, for example. There's Voldarin Epicure that sometimes gets run in that deck that has 1 toughness. Targets come up. More so, I think, in white than red. And then there's just various little token creatures or things that maybe in combination with a cut down, you could shrink something down to being a 2/3 instead of a 3/4, and then you can cut it down. I don't know if Rat Out's actually good enough or not. But I think it's worth experimenting with, and it's just a common. Warehouse Tabby. So the price is right. If you can manage to get this card to trigger, getting it down for 1 mana is useful. Whenever an enchantment you control is put in a graveyard from the battlefield, you get a rat. It can't block, you know the drill. And the Warehouse Tabby itself can also gain Death Touch. That's not nothing. Obviously you would rather not have to invest 2 mana into it to do that, but if this blocks a Sholdred and you've got at least a decent shot at it, why not sink the mana into it? If the opponent cuts it down at that point, you still got to block their Shoulder. That's 4 damage you didn't take, So this card could do some work for you if you've got an enchantment sacrificing deck. And it doesn't just happen once per turn, right? So if you can send a lot of enchantments to the graveyard all at the same time, you get a lot of rats. I'm not sure exactly how you accomplish that. Maybe Twisted Sewer Witch? Possibly? Could get that many auras on the battlefield all at the same time, and then they can all go to the graveyard. You can get a bunch of rats. Could be interesting. Just, it's hard to look out for. If there's some synergy you've got with cycling enchantments in and out of play, then the Warehouse Tabby starts to look better. Starts to look like an interesting engine for the deck. Fairy Fencing. This is well above rate if you have a fairy in play. Right? -3/-3 for 1 black is an amazing deal. And all you have to do is control a fairy as you cast the spell. It doesn't matter at the point the spell resolves if you still have any fairies on the battlefield. So Once you've played this and you had the fairy out, it's too late. It's going to do the full minus. If you don't have a fairy, it's a below rate removal spell. At that point, you might as well have been running like March of Wretched Sorrow or some other card. Maybe the Black Sun's Twilight. Right? If you don't have a fairy, there are better options that do similar effects. But if you have fairies, then this is really premium removal. The Witch's Vanity. I'm really uncertain about this card. So, Chapter 1, it destroys a creature an opponent controls with mana value 2 or less. Now, you can hit some good high-value targets this way. Alright, you could pick off a Thalia for 3 mana, you could pick off a Bunicorn for 2 mana. There are plenty of targets to hit if you're up against like an aggro deck. And if you are, then the food on Chapter 2 will probably be of use to you to stay alive. This doesn't put any creatures on the battlefield on its own, so if you want to get use of the Wicked Roll token on Chapter 3, you've got to make sure that you get a creature out there somehow. And you won't always have a cheap creature to hit. Or even if you do, maybe a cheap creature is not what you need to kill. Right? Maybe the opponent does have like a Phyrexian Might that you can blow up with this, but what you really needed to kill was Sheoldred. I don't know that you ever want 4 copies of this card, because there are a lot of things it doesn't answer, but it's a good package of value if you manage to use every part of the buffalo here. So I'm going to craft 2 and see what I can do with it. Wicked Visitor. This I'm not convinced about. It's a little small. Right, there was a time when a 2/2 for 2 was just a good going rate. Right in our current standard, there's a lot of aggro, especially in Best of 1, and people come well prepared to deal with small creatures early in the game. If you don't, why are you playing Best of 1? So, you know, it doesn't just die to a cut down, it dies to, like, everything. Yeah, it dies to shocks, play with fire, and disfigure. Everything. Everything. The Witch's Vanity. Dies to everything. Whenever an enchantment you control is put in a graveyard from the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life. So again, you know, if there's kind of like dream scenarios, right, where you get Twisted Sewer Witch out, you get a Wicked Visitor on the battlefield, you attack with the rats, and now the opponent dies no matter what happens. Right? If the rats die, they lose a life for all the Wicked Roll tokens, and they lose another life because of the Wicked Visitor. So they lose 2 life for every rat. You know, damned if they do, damned if they don't. A lot of the time, though, probably what's going to happen is you play a Wicked Visitor, the opponent uses a 1 mana spell to kill it, and moves on with the game. I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced the card is good. But it's an interesting piece for a certain kind of deck. So, just, I'm on the fence. Back for Seconds, I think this has so much potential. I think if you like trying to build Reanimator-style decks, this one's got an interesting angle to it because the card needs to cost 4 or less. But you can make sure you hit a 4-drop with it, which means you did get a mana advantage. You get to get card advantage, right? This always gets 2 creature cards back from your graveyard. Now, granted, there's a lot of graveyard hate in the format, but whatever. That's kind of the argument of dies to removal. You can't not play a card just because it dies to removal. This maybe dies to graveyard hate. You can't think about it like that. You need to look at what the card can do for you as an active game plan. And the active game plan on this is pretty good. You mill or discard or find some way somehow to get some creatures into the graveyard. It will always give you back 2 for 3. Right? So you've got the kind of divination effect of it, but if you bargain it, then you get to reanimate something that's 4 or less right to the battlefield. There's interesting deck building considerations for using this well. You need to have material on the battlefield to bargain. You need to have good 4-drops, like, I don't know, Sheoldred and other stuff that you want to get out of the graveyard. But if you can pull off that magical combination of things, then if you could hit this on curve on turn 3, then you get ahead, you get card advantage, right? It's not just getting ahead on the board, it's getting ahead on cards too. And all of that together makes this an interesting package. And I think there could be something here. I think there's definitely decks to be brewing around this card. It could be powerful enough for standard play. We'll see. Experimental Confectioner. This is a 2/3 for 3. When it enters the battlefield, you get a food token, so there's something for your trouble already. And whenever you sacrifice a food, you get a rat. This one is interesting to me because if you're in a deck that's doing a lot of bargaining, you're not necessarily paying 2 mana when you sacrifice food. You might be, going back for seconds. You might be doing a Rowan's Grim Search. And if you're doing that, then you can be putting out rats. Doesn't have to be just once a turn either. So as long as you have a source of food, you have a source of rats. And that's pretty neat. It dies to a cut down and such, but having 3 toughness makes it at least a little bit more of a consideration for going up against like a red deck, things like that. At least red has to pay 2 mana most of the time to kill this. You feel really bad when you commit something to the field and they can burn it out of the way for 1. If Experimental Confectioner eats a lightning strike, you don't feel quite as bad about that. If white gets it out of the way with Brutal Cathar, you still got the food left over. It's not amazing or anything. And you'd much rather that it sticks on the battlefield so you can get the rat engine going. But I could see a world, I could see a standard where this is a good chunk of value and a good engine for turning food into rats. I see potential here. It's just an uncommon. Speaking of uncommons, we have Lord Skitter's Butcher. This is another 2/3. It can make a rat as one of its options. So even if it does get cut down, you still have a body on the field. They can't block, but you could bargain with it. You could sacrifice it to Liliana to protect your other creatures, that kind of thing. That's useful. You can also sack another creature to scry to draw a card, and you can also give creatures you control Menace. That last ability, if anyone has played a Rats deck, then you know that that's one of the killers. This coming down and giving a wide board of Rats Menace can just end the game. Can be the nail in the coffin for the opponent. Now, if you want to do the Rats deck, this may very well be a 4-of for you. Since I'm just kind of highlighting it here as a flexible card that could go in a variety of decks, not just Rats. just highlighting it as a 2 of at the moment, but you probably know if you left the rat deck that you ought to have all 4 of this. That menace, yeah, just completely ends the game. And the other 2 modes are also very good for the deck. Alright, Rowan's Grim Search. I have an instant here. It can always be draw 2 cards, lose 2 life. Which, as an instant, that card has been borderline playable in Standard. I won't say good, but it's been borderline playable. If you bargain this, you can look at the top 4 cards of your library and put up to 2 of them back on top. So you don't have to. You could put 1 on top, you could put 0 on top. So this card could theoretically let you see 6 cards. If you dump all 4 into your graveyard, and then blindly draw 2 off the top, you've seen 6 cards that way, if the first 4 didn't have what you needed. That's pretty good for a common. Really and truly, it's pretty good. It's not a sorcery, it's an instant. So, all of that seems like could be really useful. Could help you find your pieces in a combo deck, could just help you dig down in a control deck to find what you really are looking for. I mean, being able to go as much as 6 cards deep, that's a real deal for 3 mana at instant speed. You need something to bargain, but then that's kind of part of the fun of deck building, right? Ashiok's Reaper. I am not convinced that this enchantment sacrificing deck is going to be a thing, but this is an engine card. It's not limited to once per turn. It's whenever an enchantment you control is put in a graveyard from the battlefield. So again, if you had a pile of rats that had a pile of Wicked Roll tokens from the Twisted Sewer Witch, Ashiok's Reaper could draw you a pile of cards when those rats die. It's something. Fell Horseman. So this card might not be quite good enough, but all the way around I find it interesting. So the Adventurer lets you return a creature from the graveyard to your hand. That's fine. As long as you got a target down there, then, that ability replaces itself, and then you still are left over with the Fell Horseman, which is nothing exciting. It's just a 3/3 Zombie Knight for 4. It has this odd line of text. When the Fell Horseman dies, you put it on the bottom of its owner's library. So it kind of sort of reshuffles itself back in for free. And there's I won't go on too long about it because that's only a very, very small amount of value. There might be some decks where you would rather it be in your graveyard. But there is a minor amount of value to be had out of things automatically putting themselves back into your library again. It makes you slightly more resistant to mill strategies. It means that if you have effects that shuffle your deck, it increases the odds you'll see the card again during the game. And if you do that, then you can pull more creatures back out of your graveyard again. It can start netting you more cards over time. I don't think it's great or anything. And probably I won't end up using the card very much, if at all. It's just, there's a little something about this card, kind of like if this was 15 years ago. It'd be a little hint of curiosity about whether or not this card might do something. I don't think it's the worst, but it's probably not good enough anymore. And Twisted Sewer Witch. The more I thought about this card, I realized that it always creates a rat and puts a Wicked Roll token on that rat. And that means on a blank board, right, you don't have any other rats, you get the Twisted Sewer Witch, you put 5 power and 6 toughness onto the battlefield, along with an aura. So you put 3 permanents onto the battlefield, 5 power, 6 toughness. The opponent loses a life if they kill that Wicked Roll token. And that's not bad at all. That's, yeah, that's a reasonable chunk of bodies on the field there. And that's if you don't have any other rats. You know, every additional rat that you have past that, you know, then you go to like 6 power and 7 toughness, and 7 power and 8 toughness. And, you know, it's a pretty good rate for a 5-drop. I won't say it's broken, but I would say it's fair. You know, fair in a standard deck to have a pretty reasonable impact on the board as a 5-drop. Be much better if rats could block, obviously. Or at least the token rats can't block. I don't know, though. It seems like with all the enchantments that this could put out, with all the power and toughness that this can put out, there could be something here. Maybe. I'm not totally convinced, but I feel like she might be better than she looks. So, just food for thought. Alright. This is a lot of wild cards that I'm going to use here. Black is, right after green, black is like my second favorite color in Magic. I'm going to go ahead and do it. Moving on to rares and mythics. Spiteful Hexmage. This card is good. I don't know if you got the memo on that. This card's just good. There's multiple ways to try to make use of it. You can replace the roll token that's on it. For example, there's the white card, 2-drop, you pay 1 every combat step and you put a roll token on a creature. That can swap this out from being a 1-1 into a 4-3 suddenly. I think one of the cool things you could do with this is bargaining away the cursed roll token. So your 1-1 turns into a 3-2 and you have to sacrifice the cursed roll token to get some benefit for yourself. That seems cool to me. It feels like there are a lot of ways to get use out of the Spiteful Hexmage. Right? You could put the cursed roll token on something you were going to sacrifice anyway. There are a lot of scenarios where you get the 3-2 for 1 mana. And that is a big deal. It's a really oversized creature for its mana cost. Anything that's 1 or 2 mana that seems like it is beyond its normal rate is a Magic card that might see play into Eternal formats. That might be something really powerful. So, I think this one's good. Alright, Tangled Colony. So, obviously, first and foremost, if you're playing the Rats deck, this is a, good aggressive 2-drop. Can't block, so obviously doesn't really help to keep you alive. But when this dies, you get X rat tokens that can't block, where X is the amount of damage that was dealt to it. If you have something funky going on in your deck, or some card that maybe people have ignored because it deals damage to your own creature, something like that, maybe there's some kind of combo here. So this isn't just for a rat deck, this is potentially maybe a combo piece if there's some effect that would deal a lot of damage to your own creature. Let me just throw out a kernel of an idea here. Let's say you're in a Fight Club deck where you've got the Phyrexian Obliterator and you've got a bunch of fight spells. Why not have the Tangled Colony in that deck too? It could fight something really big. Maybe kill it, maybe not, but you get a lot of rats. Make this thing fight a track. Say you get 7 rats. Maybe you can do something with 7 rats. Or, you can fight the opponent's Titan of Industry. You break the shield counter on the Titan of Industry and you get 7 rats. I'm not saying that's, worth it just on that alone, but it's interesting. And there might be some way to deal a bunch of damage to your own creature and profit from it. So, this one has more deck building possibilities than at first glance. Lord Skitter, Sewer King, this is just a really rock solid card. Because it is legendary, I would only say necessarily to craft a copy of it, like 1. If you're not in the rat deck, you probably don't want more than 1. However, this is a constant source of new creatures to attack with, and it is also graveyard hate. And a 3/3 for 3 is a reasonable presence on the battlefield, nothing exciting, but reasonable. So between being a token generator, a graveyard hate engine, and just a reasonable chunk of creature on the battlefield, I think you could do much worse than having a copy of Lord Skitter Sewer King floating around in your deck. And if you're in the rat deck, then obviously you might want to have multiple copies of Lord Skitter Sewer King. Rankle's Prank. So, the main reason I think this could be a little bit playable is there's an old uncommon card called Barter in Blood. It's the same price, 2 black, 2 colorless, sorcery. The only thing that one does is each player sacrifices 2 creatures. And it was always possible to break the symmetry. It was always possible to break the symmetry on Barter in Blood because you either profit from your creatures being sacrificed or you don't have any creatures to sacrifice. Rankle's Prank can do the same thing here. So that third mode on the card already has me thinking a little bit about, it's modestly playable, modestly. Because it can always be a Barter in Blood. You can also make each player lose 4 life. You know for yourself whether the game state is such that that would be a good idea or a bad idea, but it's an option. I had a red burn deck that I used. It used a card for 2 mana that dealt 4 damage to each player. And I dealt so much damage so quickly to the opponent with that deck that I usually never missed that life. Just having 4 damage for 2 was worth it in that red deck. Now, this is double the price of that. I don't know if you can use it aggressively in the same way as a 4-drop, but maybe. It can go 4 to the face, and that is an interesting option to have as, it could be the top of your curve in an aggressive deck at 4 mana. And each player discards 2 cards. Sometimes the cards in your hand are not relevant to the situation, and sometimes they're land, and sometimes you just don't have any other cards in your hand. So, situationally, all of these could be useful. Does that add up to a good card? I'm not sure. I think if you're going to use it for the Barter in Blood, like the third aspect down there where each player sacrifices 2 creatures, if you build your deck with that one in mind, where it's almost always the thing that you want this card to do, with the added upside that you could choose other modes on it as well, and you have the option to choose all the modes. In a deck that fits that criteria, this could be a good spell, I think. Could also be a 4 burn to the face in an aggressive deck that has other modes on it. Like if you have a little aggressive deck with a lot of small creatures, sacrificing 2 might mean that you clear out their only 2 blockers. You still have plenty of attackers to come in with, win the game. I'm not sold on it exactly, but I don't think it's just garbage. I think there are ways that you can build around it, and you can make it of use. The end. In the case of this card, it doesn't sound like a happy ending, though. 2 black, 2 colorless, instant, costs 2 less if your life total is 5 or less. You're really on the ropes at that point, but yeah, there is some amount of time, less than 0. I mean, sorry, more than 0. More than a 0% amount of the time you could cast it for 2 black. Exile target creature or planeswalker. Alright, 4 mana is kind of the going rate for an exile effect on that. It's at instant speed. Search the controller's graveyard, hand, and library for any number of cards with the same name as that permanent. Exile them. The player shuffles, then draws a card for each card exiled from their hand this way. And it's basically the templating that they use for this kind of card nowadays. It used to be that you didn't get any cards back for the ones that were exiled from your hand way back in the day. As to whether or not this card is good, I think it's okay. I think it's a pretty reasonable sideboard card. I think 1 or 2 copies of it is easily main deckable. Sometimes the opponent's doing something and you're going to have trouble with their deck and their style of play. And so if you're able to get rid of every copy of Teferi, or get rid of every copy of Chandra, or every copy of Atraxa, maybe that gives your deck a fighting chance in a game where you otherwise wouldn't. It could also be pretty good in a situation where you're not necessarily unfavored in the matchup, but it just hits a really crucial card out of the opponent's deck that they're going to have trouble beating you without. Like, I don't know, Brutal Cathar or something. If you know that they no longer can top deck a Brutal Cathar or a Werefox or whatever, then maybe they're in trouble. I think 1 or 2 copies of this is pretty safe. I don't think you should necessarily go for all 4, though. Beseech the Mirror is a mythic. It might be worth it, though. 3 black and 1 sorcery. You can search for a card, and if you don't bargain, then it's like a Diabolic Tutor with 3 black pips. That's not amazing, but it's not terrible either. It's alright. If you have time, or mana, or both, then that would be okay. It's much more exciting if you bargain. Then you can cast the exiled card without paying its mana cost if it's 4 or less. It doesn't have to be a permanent. It could be Depopulate. You know, it could be a sorcery, an instant, an enchantment. It could be whatever. And that's kind of exciting. Well, some people might just use this as, you know, extra copies of Sheoldred. And sometimes Sheoldred will be the right choice, but the flexibility on this card, you could run a real toolbox of a deck if you got Beseech the Mirror. And that could be a lot of fun. As long as you can hit the bargain. And there are plenty of ways to do that. Let me give you an example. Alright, Blood Fountain. Blood Fountain is 1 mana. It puts 2 artifacts onto the battlefield. Those are both material that you can sacrifice to bargain with. You know, you could get rid of the blood token first, and then at some point, maybe if you didn't end up sacrificing the blood fountain, maybe the blood fountain can draw you 2 cards by pulling 2 creatures back from your graveyard to your hand. If not, you can just sacrifice it. And it was 2 bargains for the price of 1 black mana. And that seems like a pretty good way to populate the battlefield with stuff to sacrifice. There are other cards like this too. You can hunt around and find them, but this is in black. So Beseech the Mirror, is it worth it? Yeah, probably. It probably is. I'm pretty sure I'm going to craft some... There is some stiff competition among the mythics. We'll see. Lich Knight's Conquest. This looks like fun. So it's a reanimator spell, but it can reanimate multiple things. As long as you have things to bargain. It doesn't actually say the word bargain on the card, but it uses the same templating. An artifact, an enchantment, or a token. So, yeah, you could reanimate 2 things, 5 things. Seems really good. Probably if you get 2 things with this card, then you've gotten way, way ahead in the game. You know, you get like a Titan of Industry and an Atraxa, something like that. That's a lot of battlefield presence, and that's a lot of cards in your hand. As long as you can put the material out there, then you can get the things into the yard. Then this is going to be pretty amazing. I think it's worth playing around with. See if it can make a Lich Knight's Conquest deck. Ashiok, Wicked Manipulator. Here's another good black mythic. So if you would pay life while your library has at least that many cards in it, exile that many cards from the top of your library instead. This is an amazing alternate cost instead of life. You know, it doesn't set you up to get milled out by mono red because you're still taking damage most of the time. It's only when you pay life, not when you lose life or take damage. So your library is unlikely to run out of cards unless the opponent's making a concerted effort to mill you. And you may remember way back in one of my very first Deckbuilding Toolbox series videos that I said that the Phyrexian Staff, where all the modes are paying life, that I said that card was amazing and was worthwhile and would be a great tool for deck building. I stand by that. I had a good time, you know, putting it in some decks, using it here and there. The Proliferate on it was actually particularly good. Now we've got Ashiok. And that staff is doing some real work next to Ashiok. You can always use it as a mana rock, and that's got a bunch of other modes. It's great. And Ashiok is pretty great. Putting out 2 creatures for -2 is rock solid. Gives you a lot of blockers. You get card advantage and card selection with the +1s. And then at -7, I've seen that number scale up to some scary stuff on Ashiok. Like, I was in a game where my opponent's Ashiok was up to, I think, 89 was the total mana value of cards you own in exile. Which, that was genuinely frightening. I happened to be playing a mono-white control deck that had over 200 cards in it, so I was not in any threat of being milled out, but still. In a normal game of Magic, it would have been a scary number. All the way around, I like this Ashiok. I think this is a really good card. It's nice that the tokens can scale up too. They don't scale up as quickly as the ones that Teferi makes, but still. They scale up pretty rapidly, pretty dramatically. Spectre of Mortality. This might be more of a sideboard card. I think you'd be okay running it as a one-of, maybe, in best of one. If you know you're going to have creatures, you know you're going to put some stuff in the graveyard, there will be times where you need to wipe the board, and maybe you don't need to kill a bunch of Atraxos. Maybe you're just trying to survive against aggro. You've been trading resources with them, you know, your creatures have been hitting the bin. You get down the Spectre of Mortality, you wipe their board, you still have your Spectre of Mortality. Plus any creature that had enough toughness to survive the minus effect. It could be a one-sided Wrath for you, under good conditions. It seems like this card floating around in your deck is pretty reasonable tech as an answer to White Sun's Twilight. I've seen a number of control decks that try to use White Sun's Twilight as their finisher. If you happen to have one or two Spectre of Mortality, you only have to exile one thing out of your graveyard, kill all of those mites, put the opponent back to square one as far as finishing the game. Yeah, I think you could definitely see a copy, maybe two, in best of one. I don't think I'd go more than one or two, though. Malevolent Witchknight, I've got good news for you. If you like this card, you're going to get 4 copies of it if you buy into the Mastery Tree. If you buy into the Mastery Tree and you advance far enough up, there are these rares that I think are, well, what are they? Jumpstart rares? Starter deck rares? Not exactly sure. But you get 4 copies. There's one for each of the colors, white, blue, black, red, and green. And they go in order. You get the white ones first, then the blue ones, I think. Maybe. Then you should hit the Malevolent Witchknight about midway, going up the tree. Which means you should get to these somewhere during the season at some point. Some of those cards are not good. This one, I at least am curious about. So, you get a 5/4 flyer, it's kind of whatever. But when it enters the battlefield, you can sacrifice any number of artifacts, enchantments, and/or tokens and draw that many cards. And, wow, if that's what your deck does, that could be really, really good. I do see potential with this card. If you're not a ramp deck, right, if you're not doing something specific to get up to 6 mana, or this isn't like the win condition linchpin of your deck, I don't think you'd run 4 of it ever. You'd probably run like 1 or 2 as a interesting top-end thing that your bargain deck can do. And then maybe you can get it back from the graveyard and do it over again. But this one has more potential to it, I feel, than some of the other rares of this cycle. The green rare in this cycle seems especially bad to me. This black one seems alright. Like, interesting enough to toy around with. And the good news is you might not have to spend any cards to craft it. You might just get it. So. And we got Virtue of Persistence. If you've been playing much Standard, watching what's happening in Standard recently, you probably know by now that this is a great piece of removal. Lochthwain's Scorn could almost be the name of this card. Because the 2-mana sorcery that gives something -3/-3 and you gain 2 life, that is a big deal. That is especially a big deal in Best of 1. Where there is so much aggro, and to some extent mid-range. -3/-3, gain 2 life is a heck of a good removal spell. It is well placed in our metagame. Especially the best of 1 metagame. And then there's this 7 mana enchantment, which is kind of like, you know, Portal to Phyrexia. It doesn't make the opponent sacrifice 3 things when it comes down. It also is only 7 mana instead of 9 mana. And you got to play this removal at 2 mana, which in a lot of ways probably makes it better than Portal to Phyrexia. Depends on what your deck does. There's no reason you couldn't have both. You could just be pulling all the creatures back from all the graveyards all the time if you're on a Virtue of Persistence Portal to Phyrexia deck. This card is phenomenal. It's just exceptionally good because the 2 mana removal mode on it is so good. That then you get to have this giant 7 mana end game that's baked into your deck as well that was attached to your 2 mana removal spell. That's why it's such an amazing card. Alright. So I've been using 3 rares and 1 mythic up to this point, but I am especially fond of black. So I think I may go over that budget a little bit here. I think a 1 of Lord Skitter Sewer King, this could go even into decks that are not based on rats. He does so much. So Aristocrats, Piles, all kinds of stuff. I think this is just a good, solid card. I really do believe that a 1 of Spectre of Mortality in most decks that have creatures in them could definitely have some roles to play against aggro, and potentially also against finishers based around White Sun's Twilight. It gives you 1 more out against a White Sun's Twilight finish. And it gives you a 3/3 flying body on the field that now the opponent also has to deal with. I think a 1 of copy of this card is actually quite good. I know I already have 2 copies of Spiteful Hexmage, but this seems like a really useful card for making bargain decks and some other types of decks with. I want to play around with it, get into some shenanigans. So this gets me 1 more copy closer to a playset. This is the end, my beautiful friend, the end. Doors references aside, I have an idea for a ridiculous deck using this particular card. I don't necessarily recommend that you go in on crafting 4 copies or whatever. This is just my 2nd copy of it. And I think 2 copies would not be that crazy in a lot of black decks. Exile is sometimes what you want. And on rare occasion, this will only cost 2 mana. And you could have the added joy of seeing the cards in your opponent's hand, looking at their library, removing all the copies of something that really annoys you. There are some benefits. Beseech the Mirror. So we're into mythics here now. I think this is an amazingly powerful card. I think that Diabolic Tutor is not that far off from being a reasonable card, and this is just ridiculously more powerful than Diabolic Tutor. I'm going to craft a 2nd copy of this, for sure. Virtue of Persistence is just an absurdly good spell. It's a little bit annoying that it's a mythic rare. Normally, to put good removal into your deck, you don't have to blow mythic rare wildcards. Usually you can go for some commons and uncommons that fill out your removal. You still can, but you don't get this. Anyway, that aside, I'm definitely going to craft a second copy, and at some point I might go in for all four. For the moment, I'm going to hold there on my wildcard crafts. I will, continue to burn more wildcards in the future as I have deck ideas, and I'm trying to make content. But I'm going to hold there for now. And please like and subscribe. Please check out my other videos. Checking out the other videos actually matters more than even that does. And until next time, never stop honing your critical thinking and empathy.